The challenge of system change, navigating transition in a post-capitalist future. Discussions about radical social change are often energized by ambition and idealism. But beneath the rhetoric lies a complex web of challenges, particularly when it comes to the idea of transitioning from capitalism to a new kind of economic and social system. This essay explores those challenges, emphasizing the importance of transition strategy, the limitations of conventional policy reform, and the structural resistance of the current market system. Misdiagnosing capitalism. A recurring issue among well-meaning activists and progressive thinkers is their partial critique of capitalism. Books like Less is More by Jason Hickel, while insightful and well-researched, often fall into a trap, recognizing the symptoms of systemic failure without addressing the disease. The authors may expose the ecological and social consequences of growth-driven economics, but they tend to leave the foundational mechanisms of capitalism intact. These critiques frequently support monetary market trade as a neutral or reformable element. Yet this trade mechanism is the engine of capitalism itself. Capitalism is not merely about corporate greed or deregulated markets, it is a structural mode of social organization that prioritizes profit, competition, and perpetual growth. If these characteristics remain in place, systemic outcomes will remain the same, regardless of good intentions. This partial critique creates what might be called anti-capitalist capitalism, a space where activists condemn inequality and ecological collapse while still accepting market logic as inevitable. The result is a contradiction, attempting to build a new world on the same foundations that caused the problems in the first place. The limitations of policy reform. System change has become a popular phrase in activist discourse, but it's often used more as a rhetorical flourish than a clear strategy. Many who invoke the term ultimately fall back on policy reform, pushing for new legislation, taxes, or regulatory frameworks as pathways to change. While these approaches can mitigate harm and buy time, they rarely shift the fundamental architecture of the system. Consider the example of prohibition in the United States. The goal was to curb alcohol abuse through a rule change, a shallow leverage point, according to systems theorist Donella Meadows. The result, however, was a flourishing black market, widespread corruption, and the rise of organized crime. Rather than solving the problem, the system reorganized around the new rule in destructive ways. The same logic applies to the modern war on drugs. Laws intended to curb substance abuse have instead created massive prison populations, incentivized police militarization, and sustained underground economies. These efforts don't address root causes such as social stress, poverty, and alienation. In short, they treat symptoms while the disease spreads. This isn't to say that policy is irrelevant. Regulations can save lives and reduce immediate harm. But we should be realistic about their limitations. Deep system change requires targeting the goals, feedback loops, and paradigms of the system itself, not merely altering its surface-level behavior. Revolution isn't what it used to be. Some believe that political revolution, through mass protest, democratic reform, or even armed uprising, can dismantle capitalism and usher in a new era. History, however, paints a more sobering picture. Even when revolutions succeed in toppling regimes, they rarely succeed in establishing long-term alternatives to market economics. The Bolshevik Revolution in Russia offers a notable example. It disrupted the capitalist status quo, but over time evolved into a centralized bureaucracy that bore little resemblance to the egalitarian ideals it claimed. In today's world, with global neoliberalism firmly entrenched, the barriers to revolutionary change are even steeper. Any country that dares deviate from market orthodoxy risks swift punishment. Economic sanctions, political destabilization, and even military intervention are standard responses to systemic heresy. The global economy is structured to reward conformity and punish divergence. The idea of seizing a nation-state and using it as a platform for systemic experimentation is increasingly unrealistic. Moreover, cultural values are often overlooked in these visions of revolution. Even if a new system is implemented, the people living under it may still operate according to the norms and incentives of capitalism. Without a cultural transition, any structural shift is likely to regress or fracture. The neglected variable, transition strategy. If there is one glaring absence in most discussions of post-capitalist futures, it is the lack of a coherent strategy for transition. Many projects and visions focus on what the new world will look like, but few seriously consider how to get there. This is a fatal oversight. Transition is not just a phase between old and new, it is the crucible in which the future is formed. In systems theory, transitions in complex adaptive systems are characterized by high levels of uncertainty and unpredictability. Preconceived plans often fall apart under real-world conditions, and feedback loops can produce unintended consequences. Because of this, adaptability is key. Strategic simplicity in early stages is often more effective than fully developed blueprints. The idea of an integral parallel economy, for example, is grounded in this reality. Rather than attempting to overthrow capitalism in one sweeping move, it proposes building an alternative system in parallel, one that gradually draws participation, resources, and legitimacy away from the dominant model. This kind of dual power strategy allows for experimentation and adaptation. It can foster new values and behaviors in a real-world context, providing the cultural foundation for systemic change. It is also less likely to provoke the kind of violent resistance that total revolutions invite. Systems resist change. One of the most daunting obstacles to systemic transition is the system itself. Market capitalism is not maintained by elites alone, but by millions of everyday behaviors and choices. These are shaped by cultural norms, institutional incentives, and deep-seated fears. Changing the system means changing people, and people resist change. Donella Meadows identified various leverage points in systems, from shallow interventions like tax adjustments to deep interventions like changing the goals of the system. The deepest changes require a shift in worldview, which is incredibly difficult to engineer. This is why dancing with the system, as Meadows put it, is so important. Rather than attacking the system head-on, change agents must learn to move with its flows, finding points of influence and using them strategically. This requires humility, patience, and a willingness to let go of rigid plans. The market's resilience is partly due to its ability to absorb and commodify opposition. Green products, ethical investing, and social enterprises are often marketed as solutions, but they rarely challenge the core logic of profit and growth. In some cases, they even strengthen it by giving consumers a sense of moral satisfaction without requiring deeper change. Profit as a lifeline incentive. At the heart of the market system is the incentive structure of profit. While often celebrated as a driver of innovation, profit is fundamentally a lifeline metric. It does not distinguish between outcomes that enhance well-being and those that cause harm. Entire industries are built around problems that should not exist: mass incarceration, addiction, surveillance, environmental degradation. These industries are not anomalies, they are logical outcomes of a system that values monetary throughput above all else. Consider the case of social media. Platforms are designed to be addictive because attention can be monetized. The psychological well-being of users is secondary, if not irrelevant. Or take the fossil fuel industry, which continues to dominate despite the clear existential threat of climate change. The infrastructure, lobbying power, and sunk costs involved make rapid transition nearly impossible. The normalization of collapse. Some believe that collapse will be the catalyst for change, that only when capitalism fully breaks down will a new system emerge. But collapse is not a single moment. It is a process, and we are already in it. The existence of homelessness in wealthy nations, the slow erosion of democratic norms, and the degradation of ecosystems are all signs of systemic failure. Yet they are treated as normal, even inevitable. Society adapts to collapse by lowering expectations and numbing awareness. The metaphor of the boiling frog is apt here. As conditions deteriorate slowly, people become desensitized. What would once have been shocking becomes mundane. This cultural adaptation is perhaps the greatest obstacle to systemic change. In times of stress, societies often become more reactionary, not more progressive. Fear breeds tribalism, authoritarianism, and scapegoating. Rather than uniting to solve problems, people turn inward, defending what little they have. Building the new within the shell of the old. So where does that leave us? If policy reform is insufficient, revolution is impractical, and collapse is already underway, what hope is there? The answer lies in building alternative systems now, within the shell of the old. This is not about utopian dreaming but practical experimentation. Projects that model cooperative ownership, local resilience, ecological restoration, and post-scarcity economics must be supported, scaled, and networked. Education is also critical. People need to understand how systems work, why capitalism cannot be fixed, and what alternatives exist. This includes unlearning deeply embedded myths, such as the idea that competition is natural or that profit equals progress. Media, art, and storytelling have a role to play in shifting paradigms. So does technology, when used ethically and with intention. Open source tools, decentralized networks, and regenerative design principles can support the infrastructure of a new economy. The transition will not be clean or linear. There will be setbacks, contradictions, and compromises. But the alternative, waiting for collapse or clinging to false solutions, is far worse. Conclusion: a call for strategic imagination. To confront the realities of capitalism and chart a path beyond it, we must cultivate what might be called strategic imagination. This means envisioning not just a better world, but the messy, incremental, and uncertain path required to reach it. We must stop treating system change as a slogan and start treating it as a complex design challenge. We must move beyond critique and into construction, building parallel systems that reflect our highest values, even as we live within the constraints of the old. There are no easy answers. But there is a clear direction. It starts with recognizing that the transition itself, not the ideal endpoint, is the battleground where the future will be decided. And in that space, we all have a role to play. The work is immense, but so is the possibility. Let's build.